Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I would like to welcome you to this Foreign Policy Panel event and World Affairs Today program, Spying on Germany and Other Allies, Good Practice or Bad Policy. Since the information leaks of Edward Snowden, a recurring headline has been revelations of American spying on allies. In the fall of 2013, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff canceled a state visit to the United States after it was revealed that the National Security Agency had recorded her private phone calls. On the heels of those allegations came disclosures that German Chancellor Angela Merkel's private cell had been tapped and monitored by the NSA. Most recently, in July of this year, a German intelligence officer was arrested and charged with being a spy for the United States. While it is assumed that everyone spies on everyone else, these incidents continue to be a source of embarrassment to the United States and complicates bilateral relations with important allies. The question to be posed this evening, is this good practice or bad policy? We have assembled a distinguished group of panelists to assist in answering these questions. I will turn the program now to our moderator, Ambassador Bill Courtney, who is a member of the Board of Directors in the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. He has served as ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Stephanie, thank you very much. The issue of espionage among allied and friendly countries has become a surprising and sensitive issue in Washington. Last September, according to the New York Times, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, as Stephanie noted, postponed what is normally a prestigious state visit to the United States after Brazilian news media reports, based on the Edward Snowden revelations, indicated that NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, had intercepted messages involving Mrs. Rousseff, as well as the state oil company Petrobras. Then in October, according to the New York Times, German Chancellor Angela Merkel called President Obama, quote, seeking reassurance that her cell phone was not the target of an American intelligence tap, end quote. Washington, the Times said, hastily pledged that she was, quote, not the target of current surveillance and would not be in the future, while conspicuously saying nothing about the past. The Times continues, after a similar furor with France, the call was the second time in 48 hours that President Obama found himself on the phone with a close European ally to argue that the unceasing revelations of invasive American intelligence gathering should not undermine decades of hard-won transatlantic trust, end quote. Just over 2 months ago, according to the Times, German officials said negotiations with the United States on reaching a broad intelligence sharing or a no-spy agreement had failed. But during Chancellor Merkel's visit to Washington a few days later, President Obama said, we do not have a blanket no-spy agreement with any country. In the last 2 weeks, U.S.-German tensions over alleged espionage have spiked. On July the 2nd, according to media reports, the Germans arrested one of their own intelligence officials who, unidentified sources said, had worked for U.S. intelligence and received some $34,000 for handing over secret documents. In a second case, the media has reported that a German defense official may have cooperated with U.S. intelligence. Last Thursday, the German government reacted. It ordered the withdrawal of the top U.S. intelligence official at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. These issues raise several questions that our distinguished panel will address this evening. One, if no spy agreements do not exist, what kinds of intelligence sharing does the United States have with allies and friends? 2, since Germany is one of America's most important allies, should the U.S. share more intelligence with it, as it does with the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand? Those 4 countries in the United States are sometimes referred to in intelligence circles as, quote, the Five Eyes, end quote. 3, should America and Germany stop conducting espionage against each other and instead focus all their energies on collecting intelligence against countries that pose international threats? And are there any legacies from the former East Germany that might hinder intelligence cooperation today with unified Germany? 4th, should France be treated on a par with Germany as far as intelligence cooperation is concerned? Or perhaps not, since media reports say France aggressively spies on U.S. companies in order to steal proprietary secrets. Finally, should Washington establish better risk management mechanisms to reduce the risk that disclosures of secrets could undermine relations with allies and friends? Our speakers this evening are well known and widely respected in the national security community, and will have good answers to all these questions. Mark Lowenthal, on far left, is president of the Intelligence and Security Academy. He was staff director of the House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and has written a textbook on intelligence that is the most widely used in U.S. universities. The title is Intelligence from Secrets to Policy. And on my immediate left is Ambassador Richard Kauzlarich. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center on the United States in Europe at the Brookings Institution. For 8 years after retiring from the U.S. Foreign Service, he was the National Intelligence Officer for Europe in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. As a diplomat, he was ambassador to Azerbaijan and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mark, let's turn to you first.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you all for coming. Let me preface my remarks by making clear that I'm not speaking for anything that has, was, or is, or will be U.S. policy. Okay, got to get that out. These are all my benighted opinions. Let me begin with a quote. This is a quote that was said by a, quote, U.S. senior official in 1976. It's usually attributed to Henry Kissinger. There is no such thing as a friendly intelligence service. There are only the intelligence services of friendly powers. Okay, that's the basic ground rule. So we have allies and we have allies. And they may be all equal in the fact that they're allies, but they're not equal in terms of their relationship. And they're certainly not equal in terms of their intelligence relationship. As Bill said, there's the Five Eyes. There's us and what we used to call, when I was in state INR, our Commonwealth cousins. We thought about calling them the English-speaking cousins, but occasionally we had a French-Canadian, and that didn't work. Anyway, so the Commonwealth cousins. What is this relationship about? It's based on years and years of working together. Yes, it does go back to the Second World War, when we were allies against Germany and Japan in the Axis. And it's based on a great deal of trust that's been built up over years. And it's based on a great deal of transparency between the governments or among the governments, and it's based on mutuality. It's not just, hey, we like you guys, we're letting you in, we're not going to spy on you anymore, you're great guys. Everybody in that relationship has something to do, and they play their part. And I would say that the British and the Australians especially play way above their weight in the world of intelligence. Canadians, not so much. The New Zealanders are sort of coming back up. And we each have things to do for one another. There's burden sharing. And according to the Times, as Bill was reading, we began a conversation with the Germans about a changed intelligence relationship. And when we told them what we expected in return, oh, we don't do that. Well, you can't be a member of the club if you don't want to pay the dues. Okay? That's the deal. And so part of the problem is that the Germans really don't like doing an awful lot of intelligence and don't want to do the kind of intelligence that we feel would be mutually beneficial if we're going to change the nature of the relationship. That's the first thing. The second thing, as Bill said, allies spy on each other. France has spied on us. We've spied on them. The Israelis have spied on us. Why do we spy? We spy because there's information that we feel we need that we can't get through any other means. But when you have a really sensitive collection, the ultimate decision as to whether or not you do it has nothing to do with the intelligence community. This is a political decision. As Bill said, the title of my book is called From Secrets to Policy, and the thing I keep drumming into my students' heads over across the street at Hopkins is that we work for the policymakers. So if it's a really sensitive collection, policymakers make the risk versus gain decision. The CIA doesn't make it. The chief of station doesn't make it. This goes back to the top and somebody else says, yeah, I think that's worth it. And every so often, you get it wrong. But it's not the intelligence community running amok out there on their own like Animal House. It's policymakers saying, yeah, I think that's worth getting. And I have to say, in a cynical moment, I was thinking, well, I think Dilma Rousseff and Angela Merkel should sort of be pleased. We're not bugging the president of Uruguay. We're not going after, the president of Lesotho. We're after you folks because you're important. We actually have a certain amount of respect for you. That's not a saleable point. But it is, you really have to understand it's a political decision. I think a lot of what's happening in Germany right now has to do with German politics. The Germans are very upset. They were very upset by the Snowden revelations. The Chancellor was upset by the Snowden revelations. But they've made a bunch of demands that I don't think they're going to get. They have this Bundestag committee that's investigating the Snowden revelations, and they would like American officials to testify. I don't think so. We are not going to send intelligence officials to Berlin to testify in front of a German committee. Not happening. It's just not happening. And so a lot of this has to do with the Chancellor having to show that she's reacting to the domestic opinion in Germany, which is basically not pleased by the revelations from Snowden and the subsequent revelations of these two officers who have been accused of spying for the United States. In terms of spying, of sharing intelligence with the Germans, I have to tell you, the German services are not that good. Now, they have a really bad history, okay? They have this mental legacy of the Gestapo and the SS and the SD and the Abwehr and the Stasi in East Germany. So they have an issue, because their intelligence for so many years ran without any regard to law, order, civil liberties. So you can understand the reaction formation, as they say in psychology. But having said that, let's be serious. The German services aren't that good. They're just not. They're not that good because they have their own self-restraint involved. And for years and years and years, they were badly penetrated by these Germans working for the Russians. And that's a problem when you're doing what's called foreign liaison. You know the Ben Franklin rule. Two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. When you're doing foreign liaison, once you share intelligence with another service, you shared with them. You can't say, I want that back. It's like when you post something on Facebook. You're toast. It's out there. And when you sober up the next morning, it's a little bit late. It's the same problem. So I have to tell you, if I was making decisions about sharing with the German services, I would have tremendous qualms. I would have tremendous qualms about their internal security and whether or not they're still being penetrated. So they're not one of the best services. They're not one of the most active services. So in terms of the mutuality that I began with, there's not going to be a lot of return. There'll be some, but there's not going to be a lot of return. So that is sort of the intelligence context within which all of this happens. Rich?
My take on this really comes from two different perspectives, and I was fortunate enough in my professional life to spend 32 years in the Foreign Service of the United States, and so diplomacy is in my blood, and lucky enough to spend almost 8 years as National Intelligence Officer for Europe on the National Intelligence Council, and I come away from those 40 years with a great deal of respect for the professionalism, not only of American diplomats, but of American intelligence officers as well. They are great people, smart people, and worried about the same things that I think you are. This 40 years, gave me a good sense of functioning in a world where diplomacy and intelligence intersect with policy. And the dirty little secret is there really isn't that much difference between diplomacy and intelligence. I mean, there really isn't. But there's another tension at play here, and I felt this very personally. It's sort of the tension between the need for secrecy and the right of all of you, as American citizens, to know what your government is doing. We all took an oath that said we will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And there were no opt-out clauses for that. But we also signed an agreement not to disclose classified information. Let me just read the sentence that struck me in this. I understand that all conditions and obligations imposed on me by this agreement apply during the time I am granted access to classified information and at all times thereafter. So this is the world that as professionals we functioned in, this constant tension between the need to keep secrets and the need to be as open as you can. I'm going to spend a few minutes just doing a personal full disclosure about what's in the back of my mind when Bill and Stephanie approached me on this. My first point of disclosure is that I think the real issue is not what the press is covering. For one thing, we don't have all the facts regarding intelligence operations in Germany, and we probably shouldn't. And not everything we think we know is true, and not everything people tell us is true. Snowden's name has come up a couple of times, and I really have a very strong negative view of both Snowden and Manning and their role in all of this, and it'd be interesting to engage in a little bit of discussion with you on that. But I think to characterize these two individuals as defenders of the public right to know is doing a great disservice to people who do stand on principle to defend the public's right to know. Neither of these guys deserve that. They've continue to damage U.S. interests. They violated the very agreement that we all signed. This is not to say that there isn't real issue of trust and transparency that's at play in any discussion of this, but it's independent of these two individuals. My third element of my full disclosure is that secrets are necessary, both the information and the way in which that information is gathered. And therefore, the public's right to know is limited. At the end, I may come back to what I think the real issue is here. Chaz Freeman, who's a former colleague of ours and almost became chairman of the NIC.
That's right.
For a little accident on the...
There was a nasty moment there.
But he's written a book, not as good as Mark's. It's called the Diplomat's Dictionary, published by National Defense University. All of you should have this on your shelf. It is just fun.
It is a fun book.
It's a fun book. So, a couple of definitions that he has in there. One about why is intelligence necessary, and guess who he quotes? George Washington. George Washington said, "The necessity of procuring good intelligence is apparent and need not be further urged." So there's the first president of the United States that kind of understood that, whatever you think about spying and all, it really was necessary. And then there's the famous quote by U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson in 1929, when the issue of whether the Department of State would continue to support budget support to what was it called? The Black Chamber.
The Black Chamber.
Yeah. He said, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." And then finally from Napoleon, ambassadors are, in the full meaning of the word, titled spies. So that difference between diplomacy and intelligence is really not that clear. So, I think to talk about policy and practice, making these distinctions between diplomacy and spying may not really be a good one. The public has every right to know what our foreign policy is, and what are intelligence priorities, but the tactics that go along with it is another matter. And there's a real discussion going on, I think, today in the intelligence community about how should we be transparent to the American public. But what we haven't joined yet is, do we have a responsibility of being transparent to other publics? In this case, the German. If you want to know what spies are interested in doing, every year the Director of National Intelligence prepares, he doesn't, his loyal staff did, painfully.
Painfully, yeah.
That spoils your Christmas holiday, but it's called the Annual Threat Testimony. But if you want to know what's important for the United States, go look at that. And it's going to be very interesting. What are the key issues? Not spying on Germany. Terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, cyber.
It's unclassified. You can find it online.
Yeah, you can go to it. What about countries that are hostile and dangerous? North Korea and Iran. Big countries that we really need to pay attention to. India, China, Russia. And then the regional crises around the world, Middle East, South Asia. Germany isn't on the list.
No,
No.
not that list.
Not that list. So I think there's a first order question that we really need to ask is, should we spy at all? And the second one, who do we spy on? And I think Mark has made the point that we work with our allies, but to the extent that their interests diverge with ours, there's going to be a greater need for intelligence versus traditional diplomacy. Allies do spy on each other. But the situation that we are in with Germany is in part an unnecessary conflict that wasn't one of our choosing. The Germans decided they wanted to make this a big public issue, and by making it public, they made it worse. And then in the context of that, say, oh, by the way, we do want you to give us Five Eyes status. That probably isn't going to go anywhere. But it isn't really in Germany's interest or our own to undermine either diplomatic or intelligence relations. There are other countries who would like to see that happen. Mm-hmm. Russia, China. They like to weaken the alliance and divide Europe and the U.S. especially at this time over the Ukraine issue. How many of you have seen the movie Das Leben der Anderen? It's about a Stasi intelligence agent.
Very low level.
Very low level, who is following the life of a handful of dissidents. And I think that for Angela Merkel and a lot of people who came out of the East in Germany, this is their view of what spying is about. Mm-hmm. Somebody sitting, listening to their telephone conversation, listening to what's going on in their bedroom. I think to think in those terms really gets away from what I think is a really big issue. And you know what? We're living in a world of technological change where this thing right now may be telling Verizon where I am. I don't think it takes your picture, but
it is telling Verizon where you are.
Yeah. How much information is now being... In 1970, there were two internet connections, one in Palo Alto and one in... Colorado. How many do you think there are today? There's been The Economist had an article about devices that are connected to the internet. There are something like 10 billion worldwide now. In 2020, there'll be 50 billion. I don't care if Verizon knows where I am, but I'm really worried about my refrigerator telling somebody what kind of beer I drink. So whether we like it or not, we're living in a world without boundaries, and whether we're in the intelligence business or just living our lives, the distinction between physical and digital worlds is disappearing. What is foreign and what is domestic is disappearing. What is civilian and what is military. The bad guys in Afghanistan and Iraq are using the same communications devices and the same networks that you and I use every day. And what is war and what is non-war? Cyber. Mm-hmm. So the real issue isn't, are we listening to Angela Merkel's telephone, or are there spies in Germany? It's this world of change that we're all living in and reacting to that's causing both intelligence services and citizens to ask some very basic questions. So that's.
Thank you. Let me encourage all of you to formulate questions and go up to the microphones to do that. As you do that, let me ask one question. In addition to the question of whether America should be spying on allies and what should be priorities among countries, whether we should spy mostly on enemies rather than friends, of course, there's also an issue about with the explosion of public information these days on topics, and let's take climate change, for example. Every U.S. policymaker and negotiator wants to have intelligence information to help support them in their decision-making or negotiating on international issues. But is it really, should it be a priority for the intelligence community to collect intelligence on things like climate change and the position that other countries may have on various climate change issues when there's so much information now available on the internet and social media and things like that? Or should the intelligence community narrow its focus just to the really tough problems, to hard power issues or adversaries that may use hard power against the United States and its allies?
I think the answer is no and yes. On the first part, should the intelligence community be spending time on climate change? Absolutely not. When Mike McConnell was the DNI, Sylvester Reyes was the chairman of the HIPSI, and he told Mike, I want you to do a national intelligence estimate, which is in theory our most important product. I stress in theory. Rich and I were talking about this earlier, on climate change. And Mike said, no, I'm not wasting intelligence assets on climate change. You can go down to, HHS and all these other places, and you get scientists from colleges, and I'm not doing it. And Reyes said, yes, you are. You never win these conversations. I've been on both sides of these conversations. And Mike said, okay, we're going to do it, sir, but it's not going to be a top priority. No, that's not where I want to spend intelligence assets. On the other hand, if I was entering into a negotiation with other countries on a climate change treaty, yeah, I want to know what's in their hand. I'll tell you, there's a famous story. Warren G. Harding's love letters have recently been released. Warren G. Harding is not going to be on Mount Rushmore anytime soon. Tremendously successful administration. Prosperity, peace, no U.S. troops involved in any place, disarmament, honest to God, genuine disarmament, the Washington Naval Treaty. And one of the reasons we were so successful in the Washington Naval Treaty was we were intercepting through the Black Chamber that Rich mentioned, the Japanese comms. So we actually had a cable that said, all right, if the Americans or British push us, this is our bottom line. So guess what we did? We pushed them right down to their bottom line, and we sank, as a British admiral said to the president, you have sunk more ships than every other admiral in history. And so there was a tremendous success because we were reading the mail of a power that wasn't quite an enemy, it wasn't quite a friend. So in the climate change, I would say it depends where we are. In terms of estimating it, I don't need an intel analyst. In terms of negotiating, yeah, I do.
Yeah, I may have a bit of a different take on this because there are some issues that would qualify as soft issues regarding social change in countries where I think there really is a need for the intelligence community to help the policymaker understand what's going on, not to make policy recommendations.
Context.
But what's the context of in a region or in a particular country of these developments? I mean, the famous example is when the Tunisian uprising took place. It started the Arab Spring. Why didn't question always? Why didn't you predict this?
That a fruit seller was going to turn himself into a Roman candle and start a revolution. I mean, how do we miss that?
Yeah, and it's kind of the extreme example, but it's that if we understood what that fruit seller was representing in terms of social change in Tunisia, I'm not saying we would have been able to anticipate that happening, but we would. That's how you understand when things do happen, kind of what's at play. So.
Also, just one other thing, Bill. We have this system called the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. The fact this exists is not classified. I've written about it in my book. The president's talked about it. This is how we manage the president's intelligence priorities. I helped create the system under George Tenet for President Bush, and the system has survived under President Obama. When you're managing that system, and you're sitting there, when you're sitting in there in the NSC, and we've all sat there at some time or another in the second row with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Attorney General and the Secretary for DHS is there and Secretary for Energy is there and God knows whom else, the list of things they want to know begins to get really long. And it's not just hard issues. Not just, sometimes there's soft issues. And it's not just, your top 5 culprits in the world. And when you start managing that list, which is what I used to do for a living, it's not encyclopedic, but it's long. And there's a lot of issues and places about which they get worried.
Hello. So my question's for Ambassador Kauzlarich, but I would love to hear from Dr. Lowenthal as well. I wanted to know if you saw any difference between the actions of Manning and Snowden and Daniel Ellsberg, and if so, what you think distinguishes those two. Thank you.
This is a very personal view because when I joined the Foreign Service, it was about the time that the Ellsberg revelations took place. And I would classify him as a man of principle who stayed to face whatever the consequences were of his disclosing that information. What you have in the case of Manning and Snowden, I believe, first of all, is flat out stealing things. They stole property, they stole documents. They are criminals in that sense. And there's been a backstory that's kind of developed after the fact that somehow justifies what they did in terms of the public's need to know. I can tell you in the case of the Manning stuff, there are people, who were expelled from their ambassadors, who were expelled from their countries because of that. There were individuals in foreign countries whose names were cited in telegrams that were published, who had to leave their own country because their own domestic intelligence services went to their families and threatened them because they had been sources of information for diplomats describing what was going on in the country. And the Snowden part, this is a gift that keeps on giving in terms of damage to the U.S. interests. Not to mention damage to commercial interests of American companies who may lose business because in the case of Germany, they've decided they're not going to allow I think it's Verizon, isn't it?
Yes.
To continue relationships with the German government for fear of some connection with spying activities. This is not some two people standing up as a matter of principle and then defending that. I'm sorry, it's just a very, very strong personal view I have, that, especially because of the people who've been directly harmed by what has been revealed.
I agree completely with Rich. I don't like what Ellsberg did, but I will give him credit for standing his ground and putting himself before the law. That's what whistleblowers do. If your concern is American civil liberties and civil justice, China and Russia are not typically the places you go because you're a civil libertarian. There's sort of a mismatch there. It just, the ACLU doesn't have a really vibrant chapter in Moscow, nor does the Russian Civil Liberties Union. So, this is just I know people who know Snowden. He's a very, egocentric. My light is so much brighter than your light, and I know what I'm doing, and I will do this. But I don't want to pay the consequences. I don't know if you've ever seen the terms that his father has given the U.S. government for his return. Number 1, no incarceration before trial. Number 2, we will choose which federal district we have the trial in. Really? The whole bloody family's run amok. Let me just say one other thing about this public right to know, and Rich and I disagree on this. I offer my students every year, I used to do this when I taught at Columbia, I do it now, I offer my students $1,000 in crisp $100 bills if you can show me where in the Constitution of the United States it says you have a right to know. And you know why I'm making this offer? Because I've read the document, and it's not there. And freedom of the press is not the same thing as the public's right to know. Now, we do believe in the public's right to know, but it's not among your enumerated rights. And what freedom of the press is about is that if the press gets their hands on material, like Snowden, we can't stop them from publishing it. We can actually go to them and say, hey, look, would you think about it? And I've been in the room for these conversations, and sometimes they will hold back, and sometimes they will not publish it, and other times they will. But that's not the same as the public's right to know. That's a different issue.
Yeah, I wasn't stating that
No,
as
no,
a
I know
legal,
you- no, I
legal
know you are.
requirement. I'm just saying that the reality is the public does have a right to know.
But not everything. But the
But not
public
every-
doesn't have the right to know everything we do. Did the public have the right to know that we were going to land on these 4 beaches in France? A lot of their boys, I mean, 5,000 American boys were dead that evening. Did the public have the right to know that? You'd probably say, no, that's silly. Of course not. It's a surprise. So what distinguishes that from an intel operation? I don't see the difference at all. But if you've already committed this crime, as Snowden does, or if you really don't like the U.S. intelligence community, as a lot of his supporters do, then you have to wrap it up in something grander than what it was.
One other distinction is that Ellsberg felt that the information in the Pentagon Papers show that the administrations, and we have both Democratic and Republican, the administrations were deceiving the American people about some essential aspects of the Vietnam War, and the Pentagon Papers did show that. In the Snowden revelations, one of the interesting things is there are no revelations in there that the National Security Agency or other intelligence agencies were doing anything deceptive or contrary to the guidance from the President and the Congress and others. The revelations seem to indicate that what they were doing was approved by the authorities, the executive branch and congressional authorities.
What constructive steps can people in both government and in civil society take to increase transparency while not compromising national security?
Well, you know, the 8 years that I spent as National Intelligence Officer for Europe convinced me that there really aren't that many secrets out there anymore. I mean, so much of what we do and say as governments, even in less than free, I mean, we know more about what goes on in North Korea
And the North Koreans do.
than the North Koreans do. But I mean, you know, there's back to these distinctions. I mean, the boundary between secret and not secret is quickly disappearing. So, you know, I think you have to ask yourself, what does the public need to know that it doesn't already know about policies and intentions of, in this case, of the U.S. government? And I don't think there's really that. I mean, I just have a hard time in this day and age of 24-hour news cycles, and everybody loves to have a microphone stuck in their face. It seems to be. And then the worst development that I've seen is letting ambassadors have Twitter accounts. That if you really talk about transparency,
Yeah.
that's it. But I just if there are problems, there may be abuses. There may be an event where somebody actually does not only break a foreign law, but break our own laws, and that's the sort of thing that needs to be public knowledge. But it's an ever-changing world, and the direction is not to greater secrecy, but to less, and that's a problem, I think.
We run, we run one of the most transparent intelligence services in the world. The budget, the amount of money that's being spent is now told every year. All the agencies that exist, you may not know how many employees there are, but I don't know what that would tell you. In fact, other countries, other democratic countries, are a little hard put to believe that we do what we do. I was asked to come over to the French embassy a couple of months ago to give a briefing to their members of the National Assembly who have the equivalent jobs that I used to support on the Hill. These are overseeing the French intelligence service. And so I was explaining that the thing you really need to understand is the budget if you want to understand oversight and you're in a legislature. And I said, you understand that the head of the CIA and the director of national intelligence have no money unless Congress gives it to them. And they said, well, there must be some money. And I said, no money. There's no slush fund. There's no kitty. There is nothing unless Congress says they can have. And they were looking at me like, are you people crazy? And I said, gentlemen, welcome to the United States. So we run one of the most transparent, one of the most open intelligence services there is, to the point where other people initially had qualms when we made these changes starting in 75, had qualms sharing with us. They said, you're nuts. You can't do that. So we actually run a fairly transparent service up to a limit. And we really do. So I think that's the answer. And it's a democracy. And you have representatives on the Hill who have tremendous access. Now, that doesn't mean that you get that access. But your elected representatives know this stuff. That's how this government works. This is not the Athenian democracy. This is a federal republic. And so the people that you send up to the Hill actually know this. And they know it in fair. I mean, when I was on the Hill staff, we went line by line through the budget. We didn't just say, oh, yeah, $50 billion, that's a good number. Get out of here. That's great. I mean, we're talking program by program by program, whether it was an operation or a spy collect or a satellite. So there's a lot of it. And a lot of it is it's sort of semi-opaque between the Hill and the executive branch, but it's still an amazing level of transparency between those two.
In your book, you talk about how all the different, like SIGINT, TechInt, HUMINT, have to compete for funding amongst each other. And with the growing prevalence of technology, how do you see HUMINT being able to hold its own and gain the funding that it may need or may not need? Do you see it as still relevant?
Well, first of all, there are 5 ints. They don't compete evenly. By definition, geospatial intelligence and signal intelligence are more expensive. Why? They're riding on a lot of machines. HUMINT has always been relatively cheap on a comparative basis.
It's human intelligence.
Human intelligence, espionage, the stuff we started talking about. I mean, it's just cheaper, although it's not totally cost-free. So, although the funny thing is, well, when you're up on the Hill, they all have sex, so you can sell almost any of them. But it's really, what you want is a balanced approach. When you're managing the collection system, as you probably know, different types of collection work for different types of issues. There are certain things where nothing is going to work except getting a human agent next to somebody who's going to talk to them. Other issues, you're going to get a lot of comms. Other issues, imagery. If you're doing cyber, I don't want to hear about the imagery. What are you taking pictures of? Well, we got a chip factory. Swell. So I mean, this is part of the system that I used to manage for the director and for the president, is which of the 5 intelligence collection disciplines, which ones are best for this specific issue, and therefore do they have what they need to go after it. So I think HUMINT, I don't think it suffers per se against the other ones, but it's always going to be easier to fund. And also the other issue when you get down to politics is there's not a huge industrial base supporting human intelligence. There's some, but the large metal bending firms, firm they used to work for, CSC, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, Harris, yada, 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 they're making a lot of money out of building collection platforms and what we call downstream activities. So now you have this issue about Congress, constituents and things like that. So they have an interesting advantage, if you will, in terms of the budget. But I don't think HUMINT suffers per se, but it is cheaper. Open source is cheaper.
But yeah, the interesting thing is the most important form of HUMINT is diplomatic
Absolutely.
reporting, where you have people at embassies who are going around talking to foreign officials, to the public, and
no question.
And this, talk about cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's kind of the ultimate form of how should I put it?
And these guys go in to see the foreign minister. The foreign minister knows why Rich and Bill is there. They know he knows why they're there, and they're all going to write memos. But they're also, it's not just that. Hey, the foreign minister said he seems really uncomfortable. He seems forthcoming. I mean, there are 2 types of HUMINT. There's overt and there's clandestine. And the Foreign Service is this fabulous overt human collection platform. Embassies are collection platforms. I mean, the diplomatic part of an embassy, and it's wonderful.
I was curious, there's been a lot of talk about change this evening in technology and how we collect spying information. I was curious about the change, if there's been a change in priority from state actors to non-state actors with the increase we see like terrorist bombings and whatnot, and also the widespreadness of large multinational corporations. In
the priority system that the president uses, you worry about both. I mean, we used to worry about just states, nation states, and then we started worrying about non-state actors. But what people don't understand is we didn't throw out the nation states. We added the non-state actors. So the grid on which this thing takes place is huge. So you worry about both. And you worry about, and as Jim Clapper said when we built this thing, you have to have a conjunction of an issue and a place. So you don't worry about generic, you don't worry about WMD, you worry about WMD in specific places. I don't worry a lot about WMD in Uruguay. Why? They ain't doing it.
This is weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it depends on the issue and the actor. So we're now in a world where we worry about both states and non-state actors. So I would put multinationals in the non-state actor category if they were doing something illicit, illegal, or dangerous. But also you have seasons. You know, Russia's making a comeback. For a lot of us, it's just like the old days. We miss those guys. Jim Clapper used to call the Soviet Union the enemy we came to know and love. So you do both. And the priority, so clearly we have a bunch of states about which we're very worried. We have a bunch of non-state actors about which we're worried. On any given one day, one will trump the other. It depends on what's happening that day. It depends what the policymakers want to be concentrating on.
Thank you.
There's also the problem of distinction, too, because you have people who ostensibly are state actors, foreign ministers of countries, or presidents, who are extremely corrupt. And their motivation in talking to the American ambassador may not just simply be to represent the interests of their country, but to protect their personal income stream from unpleasant revelations that may come out as a result of conversations with the ambassador or emphasizing certain activities in their country. So, you know, you got to watch out that it's, you know, you've got non-state actors, but you've got state actors who are motivated as if they were non-state actors too, and there is another area where I think intelligence can play a role, because they're not necessarily going to tell you that as a matter of normal.
Or you have states in conjunction with non-state.
Exactly.
Venezuela has always the Venezuela regime under Chavez and Maduro have been very supportive of the FARC. Muammar Gaddafi was supportive of the Provo IRA. Now, he doesn't have a tremendous interest in Irish Catholic politics, but if this was a way to get at the Brits, it's fabulous. And so you have to worry about, you know, they don't exist in distinct columns. They bleed into each other. And again, you want intel to help you understand what that threading looks like.
You asked about multinational corporations. Most multinational corporations try to do their best to stay away from illicit activities. They have shareholders, and they could be subject to shareholder lawsuits or other kinds of economic recrimination, you know, from being prosecuted by foreign governments or U.S. government. So they generally try to stay, pretty far away from illicit activities.
On that note, actually, I'm curious, wouldn't it be important to understand, like, if they're having different economic motives? Like, so nothing that's strictly illegal, but say an oil company wants to change the price of oil, would you spy on them to understand the motivation behind that, or a way to prevent them from doing that so it wouldn't affect the American economy as badly? Or
Foreign oil companies are mostly all state-owned,
Right.
so it's
Okay.
governments that are actually
Okay.
the ones that participate in OPEC or get involved in other things. So those kinds of things certainly are a legitimate subject for intelligence collection.
There was a big push in the, where was I working at the time? I got to remember. The early 90s from Congress that we should start doing more economic espionage. Because, we know that France does this and other countries do it. And part of the problem we have is that we still have private enterprise. France is basically a statist economy. So let's say I decided to spy on some foreign automobile company, and I discovered they'd made a tremendous breakthrough with the internal combustion engine. Do I tell Ford? Because I like them, that's a Democratic family, but I don't tell GM, they've always been Republicans. I mean, part of the problem is, what do you do with that information? And if you told them, how do you tell them you got it? And Bob Gates had a great line. He said, I know a lot of people who are willing to die for their country. None of us are willing to die for General Motors.
So the United States does not collect intelligence to share with
No.
private enterprise to give it an advantage in the marketplace.
Other countries do, we don't.
Other countries do.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
And our last questioner?
Mark, you mentioned that the Foreign Service is a very overt form of espionage, if you will.
Of human
Human
collection.
Okay,
Yeah,
human
watch it.
collection.
Not espionage. Yeah, I
Okay.
don't want to get these guys in trouble.
Okay. I'm sorry. So I sort of have a question on ambassadors. You receive information from both America and the country that you're ambassador to. What do you do with that information? Do you distribute it to the country? Do you distribute it back to the U.S.? What is your role when you receive information? Is my question.
Well, I mean, whether it's diplomatic or other, I mean, you want to. Not all information is equally important, and so what are U.S. interests, and how are they likely to be affected by that? We're past the time when somebody in Washington was going to read a telegram about the development of the port of Lomé, Togo, which was the first airgram I ever wrote
Was it
in
really?
the Foreign Service. So you hear lots of things, see lots of things that you don't report. But what is the policy relevance? I think the biggest challenge for ambassadors is sort of having an understanding of what's going on in their country across the board. We all get a letter of instruction from the President of the United States. Let me just read part of this to you. As Chief of Mission, you have full responsibility for the direction, coordination, and supervision of all U.S. executive branch employees in fill in the blank for the country name, regardless of their employment categories or location, except those under the command of U.S. Area Military Commander or on the staff of international organizations. With these exceptions, you are in charge of all executive branch activities and operations in your mission. My 2 tours as ambassador, I didn't always feel that was the case.
Yeah.
And so it's less the information, but what various entities of the U.S. government, including the intelligence community, are up to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the real challenge out there. I think the information part is the easy part. It's all the other. This is when things jump up in the press and bite you in the rear end as ambassador when you've got something that goes badly that you don't know about.
My life was mostly in the former Soviet Union, so let me cite a couple of specific examples of how an ambassador uses information. In one case, there was a certain international organized crime organization that was trying to gain access to a U.S. multinational corporation through an indirect mechanism. We learned about this and were able to caution the U.S. company to be careful about certain people. So that way you're trying to protect U.S. private citizens. In another case, I would receive information about people who wanted to travel to the United States for less than fully honest reasons. And sometimes officials of the government would approach me at a cocktail party or something and encourage us to give a visa to that person because I had some background information. And this is not all espionage, it's a mixture of information, rumors you pick up on the street and other sorts of things. So then I was able to help inform our consul to be sure to deny the visa to that person. And another case, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of remnants of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, infrastructure in the former Soviet Union. We needed to know where some of that stuff was because some parts of the former Soviet government were more willing to share information and others were not. So we needed to know where to look to ask questions, which government officials we should go approach or which factories maybe we should try to pay more attention to because they were carrying out illicit activities. And that was important because in 3 countries, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, those countries gave up their strategic nuclear weapons and infrastructure, which was a key United States goal at the time. And then in Kazakhstan, it had the largest anthrax factory in the world, and through cooperation, we were able to and support from the Nunn-Lugar threat reduction program, we're able to get that dismantled with full cooperation from the Kazakhstani government. So those are three very different areas of where information, which can come from things you pick up at cocktail parties, information people just come in off the streets to tell you about something. Sometimes it could be intelligence information. And then diplomats mostly get most of their information by taking people to lunch. And that's different from a controlled source, which involves espionage.
One last point on this. It's not so much the information in and of itself. I mean, we're not AP or BBC where we just report the facts of something that's going on. What people back home want to know, whether it's intelligence or diplomatic reporting, is what do the people on the ground say about why this is important? Or if you're talking to the foreign minister, you could report exactly what the foreign minister tells you, but if he's lying to you, which in my experience in one particular country was 99% probability, you'd want to let people know this is what he said, but this guy really means something quite totally different. It's that value added that only the people who are on the ground engaging with those can add to the information. So even if you had a tape recorder in the foreign minister's office, that in and of itself isn't going to be good if you don't have somebody who's able to interpret it. So whether it's the ambassador talking to the person or raw information, there's got to be that value added to really make it useful.
And to bring it back to where we started, when I was never in the Foreign Service. Even when I worked at the State Department, I was a civil servant. What people back here want to know more than anything else, leadership intentions.
Yep.
First of all, is this guy a liar? Can I try? No, is it no? Can you meet the foreign minister? He's a liar. So Rich keeps saying, okay, I was with him again. He lied. How do you know he's lying? His lips are moving. No, it was those kind of people. But what they really want to know back here is leadership intentions. Right. What are they planning to do? Is what they're planning to do what they say they're doing? So now you're back to things like tapping into leadership comms or getting access to leaders. Because that is the one question that comes up over and over and over again when you're dealing with a senior official on a situation. They want to know what the other person's planning to do. And so that's where you end up.
Thank you for your terrific questions this evening. They've been great. And let's give a warm round of applause to our two speakers.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.